Hello, Petey here again. Welcome back. So this is going to be my first audiobook review. But let me say some things about audiobooks first before I get into the review. First thing is that these will always be very casual. Part of that is because the nature of an audiobook, right, is I can't really, I can't flip back and forth between the book and, let me go back. What was that? It was said here and there, right? I can't do kind of heavy annotating on an audiobook, right? So that necessitates me being much more casual about this. And second thing is that when I'm listening to an audiobook, I am usually doing some other activity. Usually that's exercising or driving or something like that. So I'm not in a position where I can even take notes down. So that's why these audiobooks are going to seem very off the cuff, because they are. And that's why I said, right, these are going to be very casual. So let me say another thing about audiobooks. I have a strange thing. I suspect this is going to be strange to a lot of people who listen to audiobooks, which, by the way, I do count as book. I know some don't count as books. I can't do many kinds of audiobooks. I can't do fiction. I have tried to do fiction in the past, and I don't know why, but my attention will always drift when I'm trying to listen to a fiction audiobook. And I also can't do books that are very complex, very complicated, because I just can't keep track, especially because, again, as I said, when I am listening to an audiobook, I'm usually doing some other kind of activity. So my sweet spot for audiobooks I have found are narrative histories and biographies especially, and then maybe some kind of casual, very general science books. So that's my sweet spot, and I'm telling you this so that you know that future audiobooks will be probably be things generally in that area, and that certainly fits this first one. It's a narrative history, and it is called River of the Gods, and it's by Candice Millard. This is the second work of hers I am listening to. A couple months ago, no, it's been longer than that actually. Several months ago, I listened to an audiobook of hers called River of Doubt. She likes having the word river in her titles, I guess. And that was about it's Teddy Roosevelt, his last sort of big adventure in the Amazon. And that was a great listen. I would recommend that. And so this one's called River of the Gods. Well, what is this one about? This is about the mid-Victorian attempts to find the source of the Nile. We have expressions, we all have expressions that go something like this. Well, that's as hard as blank, right? Fill in the blank. Well, the ancient world had this, especially the Romans. They had a saying that was basically, well, that's as hard as finding the source of the Nile. Because there were several Roman expeditions that tried to find the source of the Nile that all ended tragically with lots of loss of lives and such. So that became a saying in the ancient world, especially the ancient Greco-Roman world. So fast forward many centuries, right, to mid-1800s is basically the main time frame of this work. Because I think 1859 is when the first of these expeditions that's led by the main character, or one of the main characters of the work, happens. And so, right, so as you can see, up to this point, nobody had found the source of the Nile. So that's what this book's about. By the way, there's going to be a little bit of spoiler here. No, there will be a spoiler. I'll tell you who is credited with finding the source of the Nile. You don't want to know that. You want to listen to the book, or you're going to get a physical copy and read it. Understandable. So, all right. So let me talk about one of the main characters of this work, because the first expedition that will be led is going to be led by a guy named Richard Burton, not the actor, the Victorian explorer. Okay, and he's a really fascinating person. So, by one count, he knew about 30-something languages. The thing that made him initially famous was he decided he wanted to be the first non-Muslim to do the Hajj, okay, the pilgrimage to Mecca, which is one of the 5 pillars of Islam that you're supposed to try and do in your lifetime, or if you can't physically do it right, then then Islam will allow other means for you to satisfy that pillar. And so this was something Bishop Burton wanted to do. He wanted to be the first non-Muslim or European, maybe, to make the Hajj, and he was very clever about how he did it. For instance, he knew, as good as his Arabic was, he understood that his Arabic had, a non-Semitic accent basically to it, and so what he did was, one of the things he did several things. Okay, one of those things, to get around the language or the accent issue, he pretended to be a Pashtun. Now, Pashtuns are groups of people that live in sort of that no man's land area where Afghanistan and Pakistan border one another. Pashto is the main language that's spoken there. The thing about Pashto is an Indo-European language. It's more related to things like Farsi, okay, and than it is to Arabic, because Arabic is a Semitic language. Hebrew is as well. So Burton knew, right, by posing as a Pashto, this could solve this problem. If he is asked about, hey, why does your Arabic sound so funny? Well, he had an explanation ready to hand, and he made sure to get a real good tan, which he was already more dark anyways. In fact, one of the things that's always commented upon were his dark eyes, especially by the ladies.
Black eyes, like a doll's eye.
But he did other things, including undergoing adult circumcision, just in case he were to be expected down there. So, inspected down there, okay? So this was successful, and he wrote up an account of this, and I mean, he had all sorts of issues along the way. He did have bandits, that attacked and those kinds of things that he had to deal with. He wrote up this account. It's what initially made him famous, but then there were other things that brought him notoriety. Like, he was big into doing ethnographies, and he was fascinated, kind of like Herodotus was, in in the sexual practices of other cultures.
That is how the Klingon lures a mate.
Because remember, we're talking about Victorian Britain, right? Famously very, very prude when it comes to sexual matters. And so the other thing that brought him notoriety was kind of some of these ethnographies, and he did one that was about homosexual brothels in India. Now, there's this question about whether, to do this research, if Burton himself participated in these brothels, and there are other indications that he may have been bisexual, but no hard evidence, okay, either way on that. But this is the other thing that Burton did that brought him some fame. So he eventually is tasked by the Royal Geographical Society to find the source of the Nile, because by this point, one of the things that's going on is this huge Egyptomania craze in Victorian Britain, thanks to things like the Rosetta Stone that had been discovered and such. It really began to open up, especially when that's deciphered, it really begins to open up Egyptian history. So you get this fascination, like I said, this craze with that area, this fanaticism, really. So, Royal Geographical Society tasked Burton with finding the source of the Nile, right, something that had eluded explorers for many centuries, many thousands of years. And so Burton puts together an expedition to do this. So I should say, the strategy they decided to take is, most of your expeditions in the past do what you think would be the sensible thing to do, which is to come up the Nile. That means starting in the Mediterranean, right, where the delta comes out, Egypt, and then coming up and then going down into the African continent, right, and just going to where until it ends. That was the approach that past explorers had taken. So, but this time it was decided, well, maybe what we need to do is do essentially a flanking maneuver on the African continent, right? Instead of coming down, we'll come in at the southern part. And so the idea being, we'll sort of speak to the locals in the area, and because the thought being, whatever the source of the Nile is probably going to be some big lake, something like that. So maybe we'll try and find a lake. We'll talk to the locals, and then we'll come down the Nile. And the hope being, if we have found the right starting point, we'll come out, right? We'll come up into Sudan, into modern-day Sudan, and then Egypt, and eventually into the Mediterranean. So that was the idea. Well, this first expedition does not go well. They encounter a lot of problems, and I should say that a hugely important asset on this first expedition and subsequent expeditions is a former slave named Bombay. He's an interesting character in his own right, but I don't want this to be too long, and you may want to listen to the audiobook. So, but I want to acknowledge his importance in the story here. Anyways, things go wrong. One of the big things that happens is Burton and his group are attacked by an African tribe. Okay, well, I don't think I can say tribe anymore. They are attacked by a group indigenous to that area of what would become to be called by Europeans the African continent. Okay, they attack them. Richard Burton gets a spear that goes through one cheek and then knocks out a bunch of his teeth and then exits out the other cheek. And so, as you can imagine, he is left with, for the rest of his life, with a pretty gnarly scar on both these cheeks. But he survives that. But other things happen. People get sick. So the other main member of this expedition is a guy named John Speake. And he and Burton end up having a falling out. I'm not going to go into details of why. But Speake, I think it's on that first expedition. It could have been maybe it's a different one. Okay. Again, this is what happens with these audiobooks. I can't easily go back and check. But one of the things that happens to Speake on this, and Speake's not a fun character, by the way. You won't like him, and I'll say more in a minute about him why. But anyway, Speake gets a beetle crawls into his ear, and he can't get the sucker out. And he tries all sorts of things. He tries putting hot wax down there. The most desperate thing he does that screws up his hearing for the rest of his life, he takes a penknife and just jabbing it in his ear to get this beetle out. Doesn't work, and the beetle does not come out. The beetle, basically, he has to live with this thing. So he loses his hearing, most of his hearing in that ear, and he just kind of has to live with his beetle. The beetle dies on its own, and then over several months, through the natural release of his earwax, parts of this beetle eventually come out. Okay. So yeah, these are the kind of things they're confronting on these expeditions, and this is what I'm going to get into some spoilers here. Bottom line is Burton's expeditions don't ever find the source of the Nile, and Burton kind of falls off in sort of, or falls out of the public eye, okay, Victorian Britain, and he really has, like I said, he had this resurgence of fame, and then he really starts to drop off, and at this point, he marries Mrs. Richard Burton, Isabel Burton, and like Bombay, she's an important character in the story, fascinating in her own right as well. If it had been different times, she would have been, she would have probably been a pretty amazing explorer. But this is Victorian Britain, right? There are all sorts of things that are closed off to women at this point. However, one thing she does is she writes a lot of books that become roughly bestsellers because part of what she's trying to do is safeguard the legacy of her husband. Like I said, at this point is in decline. Anyways, while that's going on, John Speake, the guy he fell out with, he's still adamant about finding the source of the Nile, and he does go back. He will become the one credited with finding the source of the Nile, and it's funny because if you look into this topic, you'll see there's still, this is one of the things that's still not 100%. I mean, you can't, to be philosophical here, you can't ever prove anything 100%. But it's still the kind of, so we'll say this is the kind of thing that's not 99.9999% shown that this is absolutely the source of the Nile. But most think that the two main tributaries, right, that come off the Nile are the Blue Nile and the White Nile. And the White Nile comes from what was called Lake Nyanza, I believe, and it becomes to be called Lake Victoria. And that's considered today by most to be the source of the Nile. John Speake is credited, okay, with finally finding that. But this isn't what he's remembered for, because, again, he was not the best of fellas. He was big into a lot of the social Darwinist racial theories that popped up, and he spent a lot of his time writing on that. Okay, kind of makes me think an analogy here would be like Isaac Newton, who writes his Principia and makes all of these big advancements in physics and such. But then the vast bulk of his writings end up being on theological topics like prophecies, trying to find prophecies and these kinds of things. That's kind of what Speake was. He finds the source of the Nile, gives him this initial fame, but he writes all this other stuff, right? And also, though, he dies through part of the reason he doesn't get, certainly part of the reason he's not as well regarded, beyond all the racial stuff now that he gets tagged with, is because of he has an untimely death. And it's just, man, it's just a reminder that you can do all these crazy things, right? They went on all these expeditions. They fought these tribes. Yes, I'm going to stick with the word tribes here. You know, overcame all these diseases, all these obstacles, and ultimately John Speake succumbs to a freak accident. Okay, basically he's out hunting and his gun prematurely discharges and kills him.
Carpe diem.
So this is sort of one of the reasons Speake is not thought of a little bit higher, I guess, when you're talking about these sorts of things. But the racial stuff too doesn't help. Burton, by the way, and one of the nice things about Burton, especially if you are a progressive leftist, okay, you can really get behind Burton because he was, a fierce critic of British imperialism. He thought Africans were essentially equal to Europeans in most every respect. He was agnostic, and so what that meant was he hated missionaries, especially missionaries in Africa. I mean, if he had met David Livingstone, he probably would have sucker punched him. Okay, he was an abolitionist, but you can't have it all, okay? Because there was one group that Burton detested, and it's not clear why really, and that was Native Americans. Okay, so he wrote some pretty rough stuff about his hatred for Native Americans. So he's almost there, progressive left. He's almost there where you can embrace this figure of the past. Not so much with John Speake, as I said. Okay, let's kind of wrap this up. I've already told you Speake is the one credited with finding source of the Nile. What happens to Burton? I told you he was here, right, and he comes down here. Well, and he never made much money, but towards the last little part of his life, he does hit on a scheme that finally allows him to start making some money and brings a bit of, let's say infamy instead of fame, back to his life, okay? But the first thing he starts doing is translating Arabic classics like Arabian Nights, okay? And these become big bestsellers in Britain. But the big thing he hits on, and this just goes to show, sex has always sold, and it will always sell. Maybe I should do these videos naked or something. Because what Burton hits on is he starts translating basically works of erotic literature, okay, from the Middle East. And for instance, the Kama Sutra, okay? He does one of the first translations in Victorian Britain of the Kama Sutra, and that sucker sells like hotcakes, all right? So do some of these other pieces of erotic literature that he translates. And the last thing he was working on, I think it's called The Scented Garden, and it's from India, is like the Kama Sutra. He didn't finish that, but I think somebody picked it up and then finished it. But these were the kind of things, and these finally brought Burton brought back some notoriety and some money into his life. Okay, but so that's how Burton goes. All right. So anyways, yeah, this is a pretty interesting listen. I maybe liked River of Doubt a little bit more than this, but I would recommend this if you're interested in this kind of thing about exploration and such in Victorian times. I am now listening to a third audiobook by Candice Millard, which is called Destiny of the Republic. I guess you couldn't find a way to fit the word river into the title of this book. That is about the assassination of James A. Garfield, which, coincidentally, I started listening to on the day of recent events. Okay, that's it for this audiobook review. This has been Petey, so take care for now.
This show is awful.
Terrible.
Disgusting.
See you next week.
Of course.